Under the thin veil of Appalachian mist, names are whispered but never written down. These names belong to bloodlines so tangled they defied both nature and law. Tonight, we tell the story attached to one of those names. This is the tale of a man whose wife was not just his kin, but the daughter of his own sister. He's remembered not for any greatness, but for the depth to which a family could sink into itself before its inevitable collapse. Yet, his descendants walk among us, the silent inheritors of his choices. Their existence proves that some histories simply refuse to be buried. Hello everyone. Before we get started, please be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from and at what time. That way, YouTube will continue to show you stories just like this one. The mountains of Kentucky have always been keepers of secrets. Isolation served as both a shield and a curse, effectively cutting families off from outsiders and locking them into the company of their own blood. Within those hollows, where cabins leaned against the hillsides and the church bell echoed thinly through the fog, family ties sometimes became too close, far too close. This is the starting point of our story, a man whose very life was the product of shame and silence, and who then took that silence, twisting it into something even darker to pass on. His neighbors didn't remember him for wealth or power, but for the strange, unsettling familiarity of the faces seated around his table. Faces that looked too much like his own. People would whisper that his children's eyes seemed set too near together, or that their speech lagged behind the other children at the schoolhouse. They said these things carefully, almost with a sense of guilt, because in the mountains, everyone knew someone who had married too close. But this was a standout case. It went beyond just cousin to cousin, or even uncle to niece. This was a patriarch who deliberately chose his sister's daughter as his wife. Imagine the sheer weight of that decision, the twisting of family roles until they lost all meaning. To outsiders, it was a blatant scandal, but to him, it appeared to be survival, a method to keep the land, the name, and the blood within the tightest circle possible. The hills swallowed his choice. The town simply turned its face away, and for a period, the story sank beneath the surface. But the truth had a persistent way of rising again in the faces of his children, in their fragile health, and in the half-broken whispers that haunted the community long after he was gone. This isn't merely the tale of a single man. It is the story of what happens when isolation turns inward, when silence becomes an inheritance, and when bloodlines consume themselves. And once you see the depth of it, it's impossible to unsee. The patriarch's name rarely showed up in church logs or court records, and that silence itself speaks volumes. Families like his survived in the folds of the Kentucky mountains precisely because distance offered protection. Roads were mere dirt paths that were prone to washing away with the spring rains, and neighbors were often miles apart, connected more by blood than by friendship. In this kind of world, the gaze of the outside was unwelcome. The fewer eyes that knew your business, the safer you were. Therefore, his decision, marrying his sister's daughter, was permitted to settle into the soil, much like rot beneath floorboards. The people around him did not openly condemn it, at least not in public. They may have murmured after Sunday sermons or whispered on their porches, but they all understood the unwritten rule: you do not expose another family's shame. What occurred inside a cabin stayed inside, even when everyone knew the truth. In a community where unity meant survival, calling out a man for his bloodlines could splinter the fragile balance that kept the mountains together. And so, he carried on unchallenged. Yet, the consequences revealed themselves in the next generation. His children were effectively caught between two worlds. Outwardly, they played in the same creeks and walked the same paths to the one-room schoolhouse, but their faces bore the unmistakable signature of their lineage. Their jaws, their eyes, their voices, they all echoed the same pattern, a repetition of features that outsiders would notice instantly, but which insiders pretended not to see. Teachers found them to be slower to learn. Doctors, on the rare occasions they could be persuaded to come into the hills, spoke quietly of weak constitutions. For the man himself, there was no spoken shame, at least none he showed. He saw this as family duty, a way to keep the land and the blood tightly bound. But the reality was colder and more primal. He was a man who had confused legacy with possession, believing his family tree could be pruned into a circle without any consequences. He wasn't the only one to think this way. The mountain culture of isolation made men like him possible. And in those cabins where lamps burned late and whispers traveled through thin walls, children grew up in a world where father, uncle, and cousin blurred into roles that had ceased to make any logical sense. This is why his story survived, not in dusty archives or court transcripts, but in the half-remembered faces and in the uneasy silence of the people who followed him. The weight of inheritance. For the community, he was both unforgettable and forgotten. Forgotten in name, but unforgettable in what he left behind. The most bizarre thing about his life is how ordinary it must have appeared to him. To us, it feels monstrous, a man lying beside his own sister's daughter, raising children from that union, and calling it a marriage. But to him, deep in that hollow, it was simply another thread in a long, established weave of families folding in on themselves. You must remember this was a world without fresh faces, where travel meant braving rivers that could swallow whole wagons or walking through days of mud. Outsiders rarely came in, and those who did seldom stayed. This meant the pool of marriageable kin was already quite shallow. But while most families stretched their ties to distant cousins, he pushed further, dragging the circle tighter until it was nearly strangling itself. Neighbors likely saw it differently. They were aware of the damage such unions could inflict. The children showed signs of fragility, with illnesses that lingered and bodies that struggled to keep pace with the mountain's demands. Yet, in their eyes, these were simply mountain burdens. When your entire world was defined by hardship, how could you place the blame on bloodlines alone? Still, there were always whispers about how the family never seemed to truly thrive. They did tend livestock and grew crops, yes, but their children rarely flourished, rarely left, and rarely established lives beyond the valley. They were trapped by both blood and geography. And herein lies the tragedy. The man genuinely believed he was preserving something. Family loyalty was the only law that mattered, and land ownership meant survival. By marrying within his own blood, he thought he was strengthening the chain. Instead, he was rusting it from the inside out. The proof emerged not in one single scandalous event, but in the slow erosion of vitality across multiple generations. His children married nearby, his grandchildren married even nearer. With each turn of the cycle, the family was pulled further from the possibility of escape and further from health. When people speak of mountain folk in whispers, of strange speech, of deformity, of families who never mingled with the outside, they are, consciously or not, echoing the legacy of men like him. He became a symbol, though never one anyone would openly admit to. He represented both the stubborn independence of the mountains and the terrible price of that independence. His story isn't written in books. It survives in the set of a gaze, the slant of a jaw, and the uncanny repetition of a face across far too many generations. The unspoken truth. By the time his children started having their own, the pattern was no longer hidden. Entire households possessed the same heavy features, the same cadence of speech, the same recurring illnesses year after year. Outsiders, when they infrequently passed through, noticed it immediately, and their stories contributed to the larger folklore of the Appalachian backwoods. These were not just exaggerations spun to induce fear, these tales of families being too strange, too insular, and too different from the world beyond the ridges were rooted in truth. They were rooted in the choices of men like him, who collapsed the family tree inward until it was little more than a loop. The patriarch himself had grown older by then, his body weathered by the very hills that had sheltered him his entire life. Yet, his grip on his family remained absolute. He was not a man who tolerated rebellion. His word was law, more binding and sharper than any preacher's sermon. Daughters were expected to obey, and sons were expected to work the land under his command. Their futures were narrowed by blood, not by choice. And so, the cycle tightened. Spouses became cousins. Fathers blurred into uncles. And the names recorded in family Bibles repeated with a haunting regularity. The tragedy is not only genetic, it is also psychological. Children raised within such confines grew up without the vocabulary to even question what was occurring. If your grandfather was also your uncle, or your mother was also your aunt, then what did the word family truly signify? Obedience became love. Confinement became kinship. And slowly, across successive generations, the very concept of a boundary dissolved. But awareness always lingered at the edges. Visitors would describe their unease in hushed tones after leaving. Teachers who endured one winter in the mountain schoolhouse would not return for a second. Preachers who attempted a quiet intervention found their sermons ignored, their warnings simply bouncing off stone. The community felt a need to protect its own, even if that protection was suffocating. To openly condemn one family was to condemn many, as so many were entangled in similar webs. Yet, his family carried the mark more heavily than nearly anyone else. His children's opportunities were fewer, their lives shorter. The neighbors pitied them, but only behind closed doors. To speak openly was to risk a feud, and feud was a language that everyone feared. It was better to allow the story to quietly rot in the shadows than to drag it into the light. With the turn of another generation, the silence surrounding his name became even more chilling than the truth itself. Families whispered about them as one whispers about a curse, that to speak too directly was to risk inviting it closer. His now grown children had inherited his logic, as well as his land, that marrying outward was a betrayal, and that blood must never be diluted. So, they paired off among themselves, binding the circle even tighter, as if it were an act of loyalty instead of desperation. It was in this generation that the physical toll became undeniable. Some were born frail, their bodies prone to illnesses that doctors were unable to cure, their bones brittle. Others survived but carried an eerie sameness in their appearance, with features repeating like a reflection seen in warped glass. Outsiders who caught a glimpse would mutter that the entire family had the same face, and there was truth in that observation. In the mountains, where difference was already viewed with suspicion, sameness became even more unnerving. But what gnawed deepest was the psychological inheritance. Children matured into adults who had never been taught that another way was possible. The mere idea of marrying someone from beyond the valley felt almost treasonous or dangerous. They had been raised in the shadow of a patriarch who convinced them that, in a treacherous world, kin was the only trust. By then, he was gone, buried in the soil of his own land. But his voice lingered. It persisted in family rules, in hushed warnings, and in the stubborn refusal to allow the line to break outward. And here is the haunting part. The town knew, neighbors knew, preachers knew. Yet, the community's silence was as thick as the fog over the hills. This was the type of secret that everyone agreed to keep, even as it grew heavier with each passing year. Outsiders were told little or nothing, and if they pressed too hard, they were met with the same warning glance, leave it be. And so, the family's isolation only deepened, their story settling into the type of half-truth that drifts between reality and folklore. If you've made it this far, you are already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, if this were your bloodline, what would your choice have been? Would you have risked breaking free, or would you have stayed loyal to family? The lingering shadow. The more deeply you investigate his bloodline, the more unsettling it becomes. Each marriage narrowed the circle until the family's entire world was reduced to a single valley, a mere handful of surnames, and the eerie repetition of faces that were both distorted and familiar. What began as a single man's decision to take his sister's daughter as his wife evolved into a pattern, a legacy of silence passed down like an heirloom no one desired but which no one dared to cast aside. By the late 19th century, his descendants were spoken of almost like phantoms. Travelers who passed through recounted tales of cabins where the same children seemed to appear year after year, barely aging, their features so alike that it was as if time had stopped. Others claimed the family kept to themselves, not out of pride, but because they feared the scrutiny of outsiders. True or not, these rumors spread, weaving the family into the darker folklore of Kentucky's hidden hollows. And here is where the story truly pierces deeper. The shame was carried not only by the family but also by the community itself. To outsiders, it was easy to sneer at backwards inbreeding, but those who lived near them grasped a harder truth. Poverty and isolation had forced these choices. Land could not be endlessly divided without leaving children with nothing. Outsiders were scarce. Survival mandated loyalty to one's own kin. And from that very instinct for survival, a cycle was born that exacted a terrible cost. The patriarch's grave, if you managed to find it, would look like any other. Perhaps a wooden marker weathered by storms, or maybe a nameless stone left there to avoid scandal. Yet, standing over it, one would see not the end of a man, but the beginning of a chain reaction. His story was less about a single scandal and more about what happens when silence becomes law, when no one has the courage to speak the truth aloud. Even today, genealogists piecing through dusty records encounter sudden dead ends, marriages unrecorded, names that repeat with unnatural frequency. Each missing page is a whisper of choices that communities hid, ashamed yet fundamentally complicit. And though his name has all but vanished, the shape of his decisions remains carved into the faces of those who descended from him. The real horror here is not just that a man married his sister's daughter. It's that generations lived and died under that shadow, bound by his silence, repeating it until it became indistinguishable from tradition itself. And so, the story comes full circle. Not with exposure, not with justice, but with a silence that still lingers in the hills. His descendants eventually scattered, some left the mountains, while others remained tethered to the soil that had both suffocated and sheltered them. In every family tree, there are branches that vanish, names that never reappear. When you look closely at his line, those gaps become chilling. Marriages were never recorded, children were born without certificates, and deaths were only marked by whispers. The silence was not accidental. It was a deliberate erasure intended to stop the shame from following them into the future. But history resists erasure. In towns across Kentucky, stories are still told in low voices. Stories of a family whose children were too frail to survive the winter, of a family who all looked the same, of a patriarch who so blurred the line between uncle, father, brother, and husband that it ceased to exist. These fragments survive, not because anyone wished them to be preserved, but because human memory clings to what unsettles it most. The harder the truth is to bury, the darker it is. What makes his tale so haunting is not simply its grotesque intimacy, but the way it reflects something larger within America's hidden history. In the forgotten corners of this country, isolated mountains, parched plains, river valleys, families like his existed in silence. They were never meant to be written about. Their names were kept out of records. Their graves were left to crumble or were unmarked. And yet, they lived and they left their mark. Each secret like his becomes a part of a larger tapestry of survival and shame, woven so tightly that even now, pulling a single thread risks unraveling the entire thing. When you hear the old warnings about never going too deep into the holler, or about families that are best left alone, they are echoes of men like him. These are stories designed to preserve silence, to keep distance, and to prevent outsiders from seeing too closely, because once you know, you cannot unknow. Once you see, you cannot unsee. And perhaps that is the source of the story's enduring power. It is not just about one family or one man. It is about the inheritance of secrecy, the weight of silence, and the shadows that never truly lift. His wife was also his sister's daughter. The community itself carried his secret, and his children were both victims and heirs, passing it on like a curse that outlived him by generations. This was the most inbred patriarch in the Kentucky mountains.